I tend to leave the root balls in place. So, for example, if you've got a mature tree which is cut down, the root stock is actually taking up a lot of nutrition, a lot of moisture, and there's also lots of fungi and kind of microbes and bacteria which break that down and kind of release that nutrient back into the soil. I'm getting a bit off topic here, but yeah, so there's different schools of thought. Also, when it comes to feeding, I've really got an idea of how often I should feed. I started doing these later in the season, and it was really too late in the year to get a kind of a good example of or a good trial of or comparison between growing in these sort of containers and growing in traditional beds. But what I think is good about these kind of containers is early in the season, especially if you're growing stuff from seed, maybe in a heated greenhouse or a hotbed or something like that, there's always that time of year when you sort of think, okay, I've got some nice plants, they're coming on well. There's always a possibility of a late frost, so you don't want to put the plants out straight away, but you don't want to keep potting them up and then keep having to water. So if you've got like tomato plants or courgettes or whatever, if you've got those in here, they can kind of happily grow for months and months and months on these things, but you might want to have some growing in containers and then some that you can actually plant out, and it gives you that flexibility. And these are all portable as well, so you could even put those outside, and then someone says, oh, there's going to be a crazy like beast from the east, late frost, okay, I'll bring those in, put them all on the path in the polytunnel, and then they're nice and safe. So that is, for me, that's their real advantage. Also, if you're growing in these in a polytunnel, obviously they're wicking, so you have to water these once every 2 weeks or something, which is really labour saving as well. So that's the subfloor. So you've got the cans, the layer of cans in the base, corrugated cardboard rolled into little cylinders, and I also use some of this wool. It's called wool shoddy. It's just kind of, I don't know, recycled bits of wool and kind of felted together, and it makes a capillary matting. It's actually really quite a nice beer. If you haven't tried it, give it a go. But yeah, what I do is I put that around the base of the can, so the water level comes up here. This capillary action wicks up to the top, and then if you imagine you've got your cardboard all around there as well, so that's helping to wick. And then to stop the kind of compost from falling down and blocking up the spaces between, I just use, this is an old cotton apron, and this has been a moisture blanket on one of my wormeries, so you can see that the worms have already started making holes in it. So it gives you an idea that the worms will actually eat this stuff as well, but it holds moisture, it retains moisture, and it wicks. So with these containers, what I'm thinking is what I said briefly with the one with the automated watering with the kind of 55 gallon barrel where it came down and fed by the pipe at the bottom. With these ones, what I kind of like, I don't know how much science is behind it, but if you imagine the water level comes up to here, the plants use the water up, it wicks back, then you've got an air space, so there's an air gap. If you water's up here all the time, your plants are constantly sitting in that, the bottom of the soil is getting waterlogged. It's actually in direct contact with the water. It's not just capillary action that's taking the water up into the soil structure. So what I like about these is the water level's up here, then you get aeration, then it drains down, it's changing that water, it's cycling that water, and then you're constantly feeding it and watering it again. So you wouldn't want to let this dry out completely, but yet at the same time it's never going to be any higher than that, because once it gets up to this level here, then it just goes down the overflow. And on this, so you don't block the overflow up, there's another can that's just had a cross cut out, and then that's just pushed over to the end of the pipe, and there's a couple of holes punched through the top as well, so that makes like a kind of filter. So if you had that directly open, soil would fall in there and block up. With these though, it's you don't actually need to glue these on. So if you've got, this one is actually solvent model, this is something else, but if you imagine there's a bit of conduit, straight bit of conduit, you've got that going through here on the outside, you've got another one coming down to make that little overflow, and these you can just twist around, you can take it off, and if it is blocked up you can even get your finger through there and push through any material. What is quite nice about these as well, if your water level is up to the top of that overflow and you tilt it, then the water's going to run out. But with that being being loose on there, not being fixed on, you can turn it like this, and then that's going to retain any moisture, so you can carry that round, put it in place, put it back down as well, and then it's good to go. So aeration, filtration, you've got your aeration there, bottle cap, you've got your kind of filter, which is a can cut out there, you've got capillary wicking, capillary natting, wicking material, you've got your overflow, and you've got the possibility of actually irrigating through the base of the container as well. And then, so there you go, there's a lot of technology, or a lot of thought behind these. Even though it's only quite straightforward, I think you can really kind of benefit and grow better plants and grow using less labour as well, less effort once you've set these containers up. So the kind of worm tower is a bit of a new concept on me. I've tried that out before. I've tried larger ones in grow beds and they work really well. But worms need certain conditions. What they need what do they need? I don't really know. They need kind of fairly damp, but they don't. It's a bit like when you grow plants. They sort of always say moist, well-drained soil, and you kind of think, oh, if it's well-drained, it's not going to be moist. It's going to be like a sandy soil, and if it's moist, it's going to be a heavy kind of clay soil, which is poorly drained. So it's hard to get that moisture, humidity, aeration at the same time. So what I thought I'd try out. This is a bit of 25mm conduit. And I've gone mad with drilling 10mm holes down the sides, so I've drilled those. You see, they go right the way through. And then I've turned it 90 degrees and drilled holes right the way through the other way. And these are about an inch apart, so it gives a bit of structure. But what I wanted to do with this, sometimes people use like a net curtain or a stocking or something like that, just to make another filter for it. Because if you put that in here, the worms are going to go through the holes, they're going to eat the kind of food that's in the worm tower, and then they're going to produce castings, and eventually this is going to block up, and then you're not going to have any airspace going down that tube. So what I'm going to try out here, it's called braided cable. It's a braided cable sort of covering, and it's used if you're making wiring looms in computers and you've got loads and loads of wires going to like hard drives and optical drives and fans and things like that. You've got a big bunch of cables and it looks really ugly. So what you can do is you can wrap those with this braid. It's a bit like a kind of on a hose pipe, you have that kind of twisted sort of covering around the outside, but what it's good about, and sometimes if you buy a bottle of wine, it's got a plastic sort of nylon sleeve around it, and it expands, so it stops the glass from rattling around and breaking. And if you use a 10mm cable braid, you can slide it over to 25mm or 20mm, and then because it expands, there's sort of gaps in the weave, so it's got a little spaces for air to get through, but it's not going to get blocked up with a worm cast. Worms, very small worms, will be able to get through, but it's not going to block up anywhere as quickly. But with these containers, what I tend to do is each growing season, then you'll take the contents out, and you'll probably take that out, and then this is 25mm, so you can run a bit of 21mm conduit fits inside, so you can just push out any soil in there, just make sure it's clear, and even just run that through, sort of swizzle it round in a container of water. But with this pipe, I've made it the full depth of the container, so that will actually go down into that reservoir at the base of the container as well. And my kind of theory is that as this gets more established, I don't know, worms or whatever kind of do their thing amongst the cardboard at the bottom, but when this is installed, that's just going to nestle itself between the cans at the base, so that will sort of hold it up, and you'll get that roughly centered. It doesn't really matter, but it kind of makes it easier when you're planting if it's in the middle. So there you go. So this isn't an Eve growing bucket. It's not the 5-gallon buckets that Thomas Paine uses, but these were free. They were local. I think they're a good size. What is nice about these, they're vertical. The sides are vertical. They're rectangular. They're all roughly the same dimensions. Some are kind of more rectangular, some are squarer, but they're about square foot. So you can get quite a lot of salad greens, herbs, mint. Or then for larger plants, you could just have one or two, or just one big tomato plant with a nice kind of tomato tower just pushed down to the sides of the container would be a really nice way of growing. For the planting media, I use a mix of homemade compost. At the moment I'm using a little bit perlite, a little bit of vermiculite, maybe 15% worm castings, and also some activated biochar. So it's charcoal that's been through the vermicomposting, and also been through a hot composting, so it's really well activated. And biochar, what I tend to use, I use a slightly larger kind of granules, so it's a bit like 10mm to 15mm sort of pea shingle. And biochar is positively charged, so if you get nitrates in the soil, and it can actually lock on to that charcoal, and then it can provide nutrition throughout the year. So it's a nice way of controlling, especially in the compost, if you've got too much nitrogen. Otherwise that will be off-gassed and produce lots of ammonia, and you're kind of producing greenhouse gases. It's really like an activated filter. It sucks all these nutrients in and then can make those available to release those later. The other good thing about biochar, and it's once again, it's hard to do a kind of side-by-side trial and say, oh, this is better, and obviously I'm not growing in large enough numbers to do really direct comparisons, but I know what works for me, and I know this is kind of better. I can kind of see how the soil looks, how the worms are. If there's a nice population of really healthy worms, lots of cocoons, lots of younger worms, lots of mature worms, I can see lots of castings. I can see the food in the worm towers being used up. I put things like eggshell in there, ground eggshell, so they've got the sort of what do you call it, calcium, and also aggregates. So I'm using things like dry not builder's sand, brick block pavier sand, and so there's lots of different nutrients. Then you can use things like volcanic kind of rock for trace sediments and things like that. But I use a lot of wood chip as well, so I'm using mature trees which have been tree surgeons have done work on them. They've removed rotten wood, and they've done some sort of pruning back. So there's a nice range of feedstuffs in terms of the compost. I'm using lots of brewer's waste to produce high temperatures, so I can also compost the weeds, and a lot of perennial weeds, they produce long kind of tap roots, but the good thing about tap roots is they're taking up nutrients from kind of deep in the soil structure as well. So if you're just composting food waste, it's easy for it to go anaerobic and stinky and black. So I think if you've got lots of different materials, and even corrugated cardboard is another kind of feedstock for composting, shredded newspaper, shredded packing material. So it's obviously all the kind of allotment waste, all the tomato plants, and a lot of the kind of the no-nos as well. So I'm vegetarian, but my partner eats meat, so if there's any kind of leftover animal bones, chicken bones and things like that, they'll go into compost. I don't tend to sift compost. I kind of leave larger pieces in there, and if there's bits of bone or whatever, they might go through another cycle. But any cooked meat, cooked food, grease, oil, fats, that all goes in the compost because it's hot composting. You don't get any problems with vermin. Not that the rats are vermin in my mind, they're just animals, and it's just their proximity to people that people leave too much rubbish around, and the rats take advantage of that. But yeah, you're not going to have any issues with that. My compost bin's about 75 degrees. Highest it's ever been is 81, which is kind of too hot, but in a way it just shows you it needs a bit more carbon. Cool it down a little bit, turn it, aerate it, make sure it's not too moist. I use urine as well. It's kind of free source of nitrogen, so that goes into the compost bin. Pre-compost wood chip. I use wood chip on paths. I use any pallet wood. All this old material would be buried in landfill. I just think, well, use it on the allotment, old scaffold boards. Use it as raised beds. By the time that's rotted down, you can't use it as raised bed. It's halfway towards becoming compost. So make a layer in a compost bin, and then compost on top, and maybe a couple of years later break it up with your fingers because it's kind of gone. So yeah, once again, it's using recycled materials. You could go online, you could look for similar systems like that. A bucket might cost you sort of, I don't know, 40-50 pounds or something, or you'd have pumps and aeration, and it would be a big all singing all dancing system. But the grommet was 15p, I don't know, they're about 60p for 2 or something like that. PVC 21.5mm overflow, 3 metre length, I think it's about £1.48, and you obviously need about, I don't know, 150mm to make one of these. Chances are if you go past a building site there might even be a bit of old conduit or something like that you can cut a bit off. I think that's probably over the top. I don't think you really need that, but there you go, that's pennies anyway. Once again, a 3 metre length for a couple of quid. That's 450mm long. That'll last for years. One thing about PVC and UPVC is exposure to sunlight, which shortens its life. And so the fact this is going to be buried in the soil, completely covered, is I'm sure that would last for, I don't know, 100 years easy. And then what else you got? A bit of kind of galvanised mesh. That's, I don't know, once again going to maybe £7 a sheet, and then you'll get enough for 6, 7 of these or something like that. Corrugated cardboard, just go around the back of a supermarket and there's pallet loads of it. The wicking fabric, you know, use old t-shirts, old pants, old vests, old kind of scarves, old wool, any kind of thing, any natural fibres, linen, cotton, muslin. Hessian sacks are really good, but worms eat those really, really fast, so. But I was saying that by the time the bed's established, it doesn't really matter what the worms have eaten at the bottom, because then next year you'll be redoing these containers anyway, so you'll have enough cardboard to pop back in. So I think it's an exciting system. It's really good. I think Mark's a terrific guy. He's got very similar ideas to me as well in terms of his attitude to reuse and recycling. But here's a sort of finished container. And these are a bit of a work in progress really. This one hasn't got the aeration fitting. I've just got the same cans, reservoir in the bottom, same soil mix, and I've got the worm tower in the centre. And this one I've kind of left it open, haven't got compost, so because I've only started doing these I wanted to kind of do an example of comparison just to sort of see and help me identify which ones are actually got the worm towers in. So they're good, I think they're brilliant, and they cost pennies. So there you go, thank you. I'll post on Worm Composting UK. That's a Facebook group. It's got a really active community, some amazing ideas. There's even though it's just a worm composting group, which sounds fairly straightforward, there's a lot of kind of science and information on that site. Some really experienced vermicomposters or worm farmers. I think the first couple of weeks I was on there, it's like, wow, I've got so much information, so many ideas. I've kind of, for the next couple of years really. But yeah, it's there's funny Facebook groups. There's lots of different composting groups and gardening groups and allotment groups, but that one is very good, and there's something about it in terms of people being really open with their ideas and concepts. And one of these things, what I like about Mark's own system, it's open source. You're not buying something, you're not subscribing to something, you don't have to register with your email address to get regular updates, you don't pay for workshops. His information is online, he makes fantastic videos, and for me it's his enthusiasm and his ideas. It's him that sells the ideas, and then you sort of think, wow, he's getting good results from that himself. I'll give it a try. It doesn't cost anything. At the end of the day, it's a concept. As a concept, it's brilliant. You've got irrigation, you've got aeration, you've got nutrition, you've got feeding, you've got less labour involved, you've got free materials, you're saving waste from going into landfill. It's a brilliant. This kind of thing is really good, and I think what you can do is, what I want to do is get 20 of these containers. Do that as a little morning workshop in a school. Get kids to all plant these up, have those down the side of the playground. So then you've got a massive raised bed, you've got composting on site, you've got composting actually in the container. This is kind of almost zero expense. There's a little bit of time in terms of showing people how to do this, but I think once you've shown someone how to do it, they can go off and make their own ones. And there's, in terms of investment, you don't have to use these, you could use a hacksaw, but if you've got one of those, you could do this as a little community kind of garden workshop. You could have an adult using these, just chopping the pipe up for the kids. The kids could be pushing all the bits together. You could help them with the grommets and things like that. They can be tearing the cardboard, cutting the cardboard up with scissors. Another person could be just maybe poking the holes in the cans, just in case the younger children didn't feel happy with doing that. You could have a wormery showing examples of the kind of the materials that are going into the container. I purchased a lot of example kind of plastic fruit and vegetables because I thought it was quite a nice thing. I wanted to have I'm doing this at a school, I wanted to have their recycling bins, so one for cans, one for bottles, one for kind of food scraps, so you've got a compostable one as well, one for cardboard, and it's like, wow, you can actually use all the cardboard. So if someone's got a can of Coke, they drink the can of Coke, rather than crunch it up, think, oh, that goes towards one of these raised beds, then I can have fresh organic tomatoes. I mean, that's fantastic, isn't it, really? And when I drive around North London, I go to the allotment and you're surrounded by nature, and you've got stag beetle larvae and jays and all the kind of green parakeets, and that are kind of native now because they've so successful. You've got that microclimate in London. There's so many blackbirds, so many robins, and because you've got so much soil life, and the soil life is right at the bottom of the food chain, so then that supports all the kind of birds higher up. And even in Tottenham there's like peregrine falcons on top of an old office block, so it's really inspiring, and the fact you can do stuff like this for free, a little bit of effort, and then that container's good for decades. I mean, I've got some of these containers, they're about 25 years old and they're still good. And the great thing about these are high density polyethylene, so they're the same material as milk cartons, but they're a much heavier wall, but they can also go through the domestic kind of recycling. So after it's all washed out, if it cracks, if you fall over and break one or something stupid, you can recycle it, and you can recycle your things, you can recycle the grommet. So yeah, do give it a try. It's so much easier to grow in than just in pots as well. I think that's quite enough information for one video. Thank you.